everybody. I'm Bob Savikanis. Welcome to our program In a Nutshell. Today our special guest is Joe Peters. Joe Peters has spent many years in government service. It all began as a police officer in the city of Scranton. He then moved on to the Attorney General Drug Law Division, where he spent 17 years working, including under 6 Pennsylvania Attorney Generals from both political parties. Joe has worked in the U.S. Department of Justice in the Special Organized Crime Prosecuting Division. He has worked in the Bill Clinton White House as the Acting Deputy Director for State and Local Affairs in the Office of National Drug Control Policy. He has worked in the George W. Bush White House as the Drug Czar's liaison to the Office of Homeland Security. Joe is also an expert commentator on Fox News Channel, as well as appearances on CNN, British and Italian television, and local broadcast media. Joe also has hosted a radio-based program for 4 years in northeastern Pennsylvania called Tough Talk with Joe Peters. And Joe is also involved as a filmmaker and producer of various local video products, including law enforcement training videos and an award-winning independent feature film. Joe, you have the perfect background for the person that we want to talk to today. We want to look at the presidential election, and obviously you've spent time in the White House under a Democrat administration and a Republican administration. You spent time on the state level under various Democrat, Republican administrations and everything. Joe, my simple question is, what makes you tick in the world of the political world?
I think it is service and to do good and to help people that you likely will never, ever meet. And I think genetically I inherited that from my dad, who was, when I was a teenager, a 2-term Republican mayor of Scranton, Gene Peters. And I think it says something that he was a 2-term Republican in what was then a 3-to-1 Democratic city. And I'll never forget, after he won and he was aligning his cabinet, and I noticed that there were almost as many Democrats as Republicans. Maybe there were. And I said to him, you know, as a teenager, from my limited perspective, I said, Dad, why do you have Democrats in your cabinet? You ran against Democrats. And he said, Joey, I'm now mayor of every citizen, not just the Republicans. So I think that embedded itself in my brain. So I always saw public service, whether it be elected or appointed, as something noble, as something giving. And that's kind of what makes me tick politically.
You're involved in just so many different aspects in the Drug Czar community, in anti-terrorism, but also in the political realm as far as being a commentator, as I mentioned in your introduction, on Fox News and various other broadcast media outlets and everything. We have a presidential election that's coming up, and it's a very divisive election, probably one of the worst or best that we've ever seen. Let's talk a little bit about just the two candidates themselves. Given credit to the office of the White House, President Trump will start with. So just some thoughts on President Trump.
Yeah, and I come to this, as I do in these kinds of venues, not being a partisan, just as you and I talk outside of the studio, you know, the factors, the impressions, what will cause the election to go either way. I even wore a tie with a blue stripe and a red stripe so that we can go right down the middle.
Be neutral in it all.
See that? I think you have two very different personalities. And I think that's the biggest contrast, and that's the contrast that hits you immediately. And I recall in my 2 years in the Clinton White House and 2 years in the George W. Bush White House, those two could not have been more different. But what amazed me, Bob, was the fact that on key issues, important issues of the day, they were way closer than you thought, because I think both of them wanted to do the right thing for the nation. And one of the examples that I think of are drug courts. Most people, sadly, because of the opioid epidemic now, and as we've come through cocaine and methamphetamine and all of the iterations of drugs, most people know what a drug court is. Back when I was at the White House, we were just trying to promote those, to bring law enforcement and defense counsel and treatment practitioners and social workers and job training and educators around one table to deal with the drug addict, not the dealer. The dealer, the violence, the guns, they belong in jail. But the user who, and not to excuse the personal conduct, finds him or herself addicted, they're as much a health problem We need to get them out of the criminal justice system and into healthcare. So drug courts were a program that those two presidents, Republican and Democrat, had centermost in their criminal justice agenda. And I think, as you fast forward, you see the same contrast. And as I mentioned, first it's a personality contrast. Donald Trump, whom I've met, is a very aggressive, out there, populist message. People love that, those supporters of him. Joe Biden is a more deliberate, someone with whom I worked when he was in the Senate on key kinds of legislation, and a man who was a father and family man first, but also a U.S. Senator. And back then, he was seen as very much a moderate, very much a mediator. He could bring people from either side of the aisle together. So you have somebody who's never been elected to anything who becomes president of the United States in a stunning victory. And then you have someone who almost 5 decades of service in the U.S. Senate, who fought his way through personal tragedies of losing his wife and one of his children, and then later his son, Beau, of brain cancer, who persevered through all of that. So I think the debate, which is just, a couple of weeks or 1 week away now, is going to tell us a lot about the mettle of each, the focus of each, and that will dictate public perception going into the next 2 debates and, of course, Election Day.
Kind of moving slightly off of that, but I'm looking at the idea of northeastern Pennsylvania and how important we are in presidential elections.
We are ground zero.
We're going to see probably more visits in the next couple of weeks leading up to the election and everything. What are your thoughts on these presidential visits to our area, whether it's the current election or going back in our contemporary history?
I think they're great, and they're great on a number of levels. Scranton has been in northeastern Pennsylvania the epicenter because it was Luzerne County that probably gave President Trump his victory in Pennsylvania and then nationally because the race was that close. Hillary Clinton, last time out, has Scranton roots, and her father is buried in the cemetery on Washburn Street. Joe Biden, a resident of Green Ridge. They have made, and the media has made, Scranton really the focus, and then out of that has come this template, that the media uses. It used to be Broadway. If it could play, if a show could play in Scranton, it went on to Broadway. Now it seems it's a presidential election. You have to find your way connected to Scranton somehow. And Joe Biden, in a week or 2 ago, used the moniker of, Scranton versus Park Avenue or something like that. So that story, both from the candidates and in the media, continues.
You mentioned in your observations of President Trump as a populist president. Tell our audience a little bit about what you interpret or what you see as being that populist president. What does that mean to your average voter out there?
I think what it means is people are tired of politicians. Politicians do not have a very high favorability rating, except if you know a politician. Congress women and men in their districts typically have a relatively high rating, popularity rating, respect rating. But Congress as a whole is down in the single number percentage points because people just don't like politicians because they don't trust them, especially if they've never engaged in the system. And then you have a media in a very divisive world today politically, just exacerbating that. Particularly with the cable channels and even the broadcast channels, you can pretty much tell, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist, where that bias is. Mm-hmm. And it goes on both sides. Right. Sean Hannity to Rachel Maddow, and there's not a whole lot in between. And I'm not being critical, I'm just making an observation. So I think that divides us as a nation. So when you have a president like President Trump, back to your question, what does populist mean? What does a populist president mean? Somebody who sort of touched the heart or the minds of the typical voter who thinks politicians don't care, that they're out for themselves, And here's a guy, ironically, a billionaire, to whom they can relate, and I think it's because of his style. He's plain spoken, to be sure. He says what's on his mind, to be sure, probably to the chagrin of most of the staff around him. And people all of a sudden glommed onto that. That clicked with them. It was like, he's like us. He's a regular person. And he's fighting the system, is the perception. Now, will it come around after 4 years in the White House? You are the system now. And can you maintain that populist connection that, yes, I'm part of the system, but I'm one of you. I hear you. I feel you. And I think that's where Joe Biden is going to those notions of, I understand your pain. I understand the issues of the day. You know, I'm a mediator. I've been through adversity. I've lost a son. I've lost family members. I know what works in government. And I think he's trying to sort of still connect his train to the Obama administration because, like it or not, black, white issues and voter preferences play into this. So if a Joe Biden can run up the tally in Philadelphia, you know, which, as most inner cities, are stridently Democratic, and Donald Trump can run up the score in the, as they call the T, across the top of the state and down the middle, and increase his voter turnout. You know, he found voters that nobody knew were out there in 16, and I think part of his strategy in continuing to play to the base is to try and drive out even more of those voters. And then, you know, what's going to flip it in Pennsylvania? And as Pennsylvania goes, I really believe the nation will go. Is it going to be the college-educated suburban housewives, as they're called? I never liked that term because it sounds almost demeaning, but it isn't. You know, being a homemaker is the toughest job in the world. But how will those 5 collar county around Philadelphia counties swing? And a place like northeastern Pennsylvania, again, this time could make the difference.
So in looking at Senator Biden, and we look at being a former vice president, and vice presidents usually have not been too successful in their runs for the White House. How does Senator Biden use the vice presidency, former vice presidency, to his advantage in this election?
I think one way is he's been there just about. You know, you're not the president, but as vice president, as they say, you're one heartbeat away. So that gives him a certain stature that when you're running against an incumbent president, most people don't have nearly that stature. So on a stage, you know, he will command attention because he has been the vice president. And I think that factor, maybe not the largest factor, will be one that I think will help him more than many people think. I think, you know, he will try, as I said, to connect himself to President Obama, to try and drive out that vote. I don't think anybody will ever drive out as much of the, as they say, minority vote as Obama did. And the trick is not just to get somebody to put a sign out, not just to get somebody to go to a rally, but to actually that day or through the mail pull that lever. And Obama drove out a lot of college students, and I don't know that that's going to be the case this time. It might have been for Bernie Sanders, but he would have lost other voters. Right. But can Joe Biden drive that vote out and get people to the polls? I think the mail-in ballots are going to help the Democrats.
So if we just look at the overall election in itself as far as media coverage, and I'm going to look at you as the expert because, again, of your years' involvement with Fox, our local broadcasting, and just on an international level and everything, how do you see the media as portraying this election as far as just coverage of the election overall?
I think the media, and having been part of doing commentary, not generally political commentary at the Fox level or CNN or other networks, but I think, you know, and whether it's because they have to fill 24 hours of news.
Because everything is breaking news anymore.
Everything is breaking news.
And you reach a saturation point, I think.
Nothing is breaking news. In every issue, Bob Savikina stubbed his toe. The Republicans or the Democrats made him do it. Every issue has to be divisive rather than talking about the substance of the issues. And one of the things that bothers me, and maybe it's just me, but when I see cable channels, and I don't want to, I'm thinking of one, but I don't want to name it and pick on it, where they have people from other print outlets. So you have, let's say, MSNBC, and you have a host of a show, and many or most of the guests are print journalists from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, from wherever. And I think that cross-pollination is not necessarily a good one, but they kind of feed each other. And at times I'll see an Associated Press commentator who, if he or she is a paid contributor on MSNBC, to me that makes it worse. Because in my mind, the Associated Press used to be the gold standard. Right. You know, even on election night, the Associated Press has called this race for. So when you have one of your own reporters on a very partisan cable show, are you diminishing what used to be the prowess of print journalists? And by print, I mean the newspapers, typically. So I think the media, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not, can really affect an election. And that's why I'm against calling elections too early, too much polling. I almost wish they would stop polling a week out of the election. You know, just like the government typically doesn't bring an arrest that might affect a national election, and we've seen issues surrounding that right now, I think you should stop polling because you don't want to disincentivize people. You know, if there are 2 hours left to go vote, I mean, that's your obligation. That is a privilege that's like no other in this world. But if you're hearing all day long on election day or the night before, oh, the game is over, the polls are showing this, you're like, what? Why? It doesn't even matter. My vote doesn't count, which is such a sad statement and feeling on the part of a voter.
If anything, we want to encourage our people, our citizens, to go out and use that right of theirs to vote. Quite a few years back, I remember a very famous quote from Senator Gary Hart from Colorado, and of course he was a presidential candidate, a front runner at one time. Some scandal brought him down a little bit and things like that, but his comment that I'll never forget, being a political scientist type person that I am with, he said the American people are going to get what they deserve. How do you react to that statement when you see an election in which it really is basically mudslinging, and it's two candidates that are so divisive and battling each other so hard?
I think there is something to be said for that, and that's not a negative toward the individual voter, especially if they're beaten down because they've been fed all this stuff in too partisan of a way. But I think, like anything else in life, you get out of it what you put into it. So you can't just complain and not vote. You got to put a little homework into it. You have to look at the candidates. You have to care. And you have to be involved enough to go out that day or to put in the mail a week or two before your ballot, because the voter is the most important part of the system. It's not the other way around. You know, and it's the same with the person once they get elected. You know, we don't work for them, they work for us. And they can't forget it, and we can't forget it. So the more you're involved in any way you can be, even if it's just doing your own little bit of research into the candidates and then going out and voting. That's, you know, in this day we talk about the Russians and this concern that they're going to meddle in our election. And there are, you know, a couple ways they can do it. One is to actually, in a cyber attack way, mess with the results, you know, or mess with the voter registration rolls. That's much less likely because of cybersecurity things and improvements even over the last 4 years. What's more likely is the disinformation game. You know, that psyops, that trying to put things on the internet or social media and fake accounts and bots. And guess who can neutralize that whole thing? Every voter. By not paying attention, all that effort, you just go, I'm going to do my own homework, and I'm going to make my decision, and I'm going to go vote. That's how we defeat the Russians, or the Chinese, or the Iranians, or anybody else who wants to try and meddle with our elections.
Be an informed voter, and that's probably
Exactly.
the easiest way to sum it up.
Exactly.
Just going through your background earlier when we first introduced you, I mean, you have a lot of background experience in the drug war, in terrorism, anti-terrorism, and everything. What do you feel like this presidential race is as far as those topics? Are they very important to the average American out there? Is it very important to the two candidates, or it's kind of in between?
I think those issues have taken a back seat, sadly, because
it seems like it has, and that's the reason
we have the trifecta out there. We have the pandemic. You have an economy that has tanked because of the pandemic, and then you have all of this social unrest. And as they say in TV, if it bleeds, it leads. So guess what's going to be talked about on TV? Any one of those three things are all three of those things. And even, it's funny, in my work at the White House, that first 2 years, in the last 2 years of the Clinton White House, the nation was focused on drugs, on countering that effort. And we were getting smarter. And we were realizing that, maybe even the term drug war is a misnomer, because you don't declare war on your own people. You declare war on the blank hole drug traffickers, gang members who are shooting up neighborhoods, killing innocent people, and poisoning our kids. Yeah, you declare war there within the bounds of the Constitution and the law. But as we started to say earlier, those people that are addicted, we need to sort of reform the system a little bit and force them into treatment so that they come out of it not incarcerated, but as better parents and workers, and they're not in our emergency rooms, etc. And then 9/11 happened, and I was on the White House grounds in the George W. Bush White House that morning. Our world changed forever. And the whole focus shifted, not only away from the drug issue, but away from pretty much everything else as it needed to fight this war on terrorism. This enemy that we didn't know, this asymmetric battle that we were now engaged in. And we were a bit asleep at the switch in some regards. We knew some things. We, out of our, sort of grasping at individual liberties and trying to protect rights of people when it came to surveillance and spying and investigations, had this wall. The CIA did what it did operationally. OCONUS, or outside the continental United States, and the FBI and other law enforcement handled civilian law enforcement matters very differently. And in many cases, you couldn't share information, which was sad. It was for the right reasons, to protect our liberties as citizens. We don't want a government spying on us. But at the same time, it created an impediment. So we've come a long way now, but we can't forget those two issues, because the opioid epidemic is still killing. Pick up a newspaper and look at the obituary and find a young person, and God love them and their family. It's likely that person died of a drug overdose, particularly fentanyl now, which is a Chinese issue and a whole other discussion. The terrorism issue, we've made great strides. That issue, that enemy, that ISIS or Al-Qaeda or groups in Yemen and all over the world, they're still there. And when you have a nation that's weak, not that we're weak as a nation, we're the most powerful, but we're dealing with the pandemic and the economy and all the things.
Preoccupied.
Preoccupied, not looking. Thank God we have professionals in the intelligence community and law enforcement that are looking on our behalf. But you make a great point. We can't let those issues become a back burner issue again.
It's not often that we have a guest sitting here that spent time in the White House. So we had President Clinton. What was your analysis of the White House under the Clinton days?
I guess I go back to those two, that easy comparison, but it's an accurate one of style. If George W. Bush had a meeting at 9 o'clock, it started at 8:59. If Bill Clinton had a meeting at 9 o'clock, about 9:20, things got rolling a little bit. But, presidents are typically smart enough to surround themselves with capable people, so that on the important issues, whether it's health care or the drug issue or the economy, they try and put the best people on it. And our government is run by career servants for the most part. The administration changes, and as it should be. A new president selects his cabinet secretaries and then the sub-cabinet level. But, you know, the career professionals, and when I went down to Washington, I refused to be a political appointee of either administration. I said, I'll do this, but I'll do it as what they call a career senior executive, which means you're not a political, because in a personal way, I didn't want to end my law enforcement career as a political appointee. You know, I wanted to end it as a career appointee. So they were very different people and administrations, and they did have their own priorities, certainly. But at the same time, I credit both of them for taking care of most of the important issues.
An interesting phenomenon that I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, months even, is the Trump stores that are popping up. I have never seen really an election in which there's stores out there selling election merchandise. So much so that we have a personality, not only a president, but a personality cult has been created. Have you seen any of these stores where they
sell?
What are your thoughts on something on that we've turned this into the presidential race? We've turned it into, again, such a big personality race.
Well, it makes me happy in the sense that people are focused on it and engaged. And if the degree of your engagement is you go buy a hat or a sign for either candidate, good for you. You know, you think back and, you know, I was just in kindergarten or younger when President Kennedy, you know, came to the area, and people still talk about that, you know, those that are living. And so if somebody wants to be engaged in their own way, the dichotomy is, though, that I have found, and this is not a slight at either side, but there will be Trump stores and Trump hats and this and that, but a lot of the Trump supporters are afraid to sort of be vocal or showy about it, depending on where you are geographically, because of the criticism they will receive. Oh, if you're for Trump, you're a racist. You know, you get those kind of quick generalizations, and people don't want to be judged that way. You know, they may be for Trump or Biden for specific issues and reasons, but don't want to be judged that if I'm for this candidate, it doesn't make me bad, or it doesn't make me something bad that you associate with my candidate.
Well, our time is getting a little bit short, and I definitely want to have you come back again, Joe, because you're an amazing individual with so much background knowledge and so much experience. But as we wrap up, what makes President Trump a successful winner for 4 more years, in your opinion, quickly?
Connecting to the individual and hearkening those things that always will resonate with the voter. When you say law and order, who doesn't want that? You know, TV show is one of the most popular shows on television. That phrase resonates. And I think the Trump campaign is smart enough to grab onto things like that. So I think whoever can cling to those themes and have something that will resonate, that people will remember them for and believe in them to do, then that's who's going to win this election.
And then my follow-up was going to be then, so how does former Vice President Joe Biden become successful and garner those 4 years in the White House?
I think he tries to, he's the softer approach, to whom there is a great appeal to many people. He's a statesman because he's been there, both in the Senate all those decades and as vice president. He can, as we talked about earlier, sort of link himself to a very popular Democratic president, Barack Obama. And I think those will be the magic pieces for him. Sounds oversimplified, but sometimes people don't decide who they're going to vote for till they walk into that voting booth, and the last impression they have of a particular candidate, particularly if they haven't focused upon it, you know, will be the driver for which lever they pull.
Well, thank you, Joe, for your analysis. Thank you for all the information. And I'm Bob Savakinos. This is our program in a nutshell. And the most important thing we're going to ask our audience to do is go out there and vote on Election Day, and may the best candidate win.
Amen.
Thank you.